3 days. For 3 days, the snow had been her only companion. It fell on her worn coat, it dusted her suitcase, it melted on her eyelashes like cold, silent tears. The train station in this forgotten corner of Wyoming was more a suggestion than a building, a wooden shack against a wind that never stopped screaming. And on its single bench Claire sat, waiting. She'd arrived on a train that groaned like a dying beast, stepping onto a platform of slush and shattered hope. She was running from a life of debt and sorrow, a life where her father's ghost haunted every corner, and men with cold hands saw her as just another asset to be claimed. The ad in the church paper had been a prayer whispered into the void. Honest man, widowed, seeks a kind woman to raise his daughter and share a quiet life. It sounded like warmth. It sounded like peace. But the man never came. Every other passenger had been met, hugged, and whisked away into the swirling white. Not her. The station master had given her a pitying look on the first day, a wary one on the second, and by the third he didn't look at her at all. She was just part of the landscape now, a statue of disappointment freezing to the bench. 3 days. 3 nights spent curled under the platform's awning, the wood doing little to stop the wind's icy teeth. Her stomach was a tight, angry knot. The hope she'd carried all the way from back east had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember, and she could feel it dying. She wouldn't move. Moving meant admitting defeat. Moving meant accepting that the ad was a lie, a cruel joke, or that the man had taken one look at the photograph she'd sent, plain, tired Claire, and decided against it. The shame of it was colder than the snow. It was a physical weight pressing down on her, holding her to this bench in this town with no name. She was forgotten. Worse, she was never wanted in the first place. An old freight manager trudged past, his lantern cutting a weak yellow circle in the gray afternoon. Still waiting? He mumbled, not breaking stride. She just nodded, not trusting her voice. Her lips were cracked and numb. He shook his head and disappeared into the gloom. The world was blurring, the edges going soft and dark. The cold was sinking into her bones now, a deep, final chill. Her body ached, a dull throb that was easy to ignore. It was the silence in her soul that was deafening. "No one is coming," a voice whispered from that hollow place. "You are alone." She closed her eyes just for a moment, just to rest against the profound exhaustion that was pulling her down, down into the white. And that's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the muffled world of the snowstorm. Small boots, crunching fast, a child's determined footsteps. Claire's eyes fluttered open. A little girl, no older than 5, was running toward her, a tiny whirlwind of woolen coat and flying chestnut braids. Her cheeks were bright red, her eyes burning with a purpose that seemed far too big for her small frame. Behind her, a tall man followed, his long strides struggling to keep up. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a worn hat pulled low, his face a mask of weathered lines and frustration. The girl skidded to a halt directly in front of Claire. She didn't hesitate. She lifted a small, mittened hand and pointed. "That's her, Daddy." The girl's voice was clear and triumphant, cutting through the wind. "That's the one I told you about." The man stopped, confusion clouding his features. "Mara, what in heaven's name are you talking about?" The girl, Mara, turned and grabbed his arm, pulling with all her might. "It's her! Can she be my mama now?" The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The snow held its breath. Claire stared, unable to process the words, certain the cold had finally cracked her mind. This had to be a dream, a feverish hallucination before the end. The man took off his hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over Claire's frozen form, searching for something he clearly couldn't find. There was no recognition, no guilt, only a deep, unsettling confusion mixed with a dawning worry for the strange, half-frozen woman on the bench. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Pardon me, but do I know you?" Claire's throat felt like it was filled with sand and broken glass. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. She swallowed, forcing the words out, a whisper against the vast silence. I'm your mail-order bride, Claire Evans, I received your letter. The man's face went blank, then his head gave a slow, deliberate shake. My letter? He repeated, his brow furrowing. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I never wrote any letter. The ember of hope inside Claire didn't just die. It was extinguished by a flood of ice. It wasn't just a change of heart. It was a phantom, a ghost. The entire promise was a lie from the very beginning. The silence that fell between them was heavier than any snowdrift, a crushing weight of misunderstanding and misery. Mara's triumphant expression crumbled, her little face contorting with confusion. But you said, she whispered, looking between her father and the frozen woman. You said she would come. I said no such thing, the man started, his voice firm, but then he stopped short. His eyes widened slightly as a terrible thought dawned. He knelt, bringing himself eye level with his daughter. His voice was softer now, laced with a dread that Claire could feel across the platform. Mara, sweetheart, did you send a letter? The little girl's chin trembled. She nodded, her hands twisting the hem of her coat. I asked Mrs. Dallow at the post office to write it for me. I told her what you'd say, and I put Mama's picture in the envelope, the one you keep in your drawer. The man closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He stayed crouched there for a moment, his shoulders slumping. The truth was out, and it was 1,000 times more cruel than simple abandonment. This wasn't a man's rejection. It was a child's desperate, impossible wish. Claire felt a sting behind her eyes, but the tears wouldn't come. Her pride was a shard of ice in her chest. All this time, she'd been waiting for a ghost conjured by a lonely little girl. He finally stood and looked at Claire, his face etched with a regret so profound it was painful to see. My name is Eli Matthews, he said, the words heavy. My wife. She passed 2 years ago. It's just been me and Mara. I had no idea. Ma'am, I am so sorry. Claire pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the bench for support. Snow cascaded from her lap. I sat here for 3 days, she said, her voice hollow. I thought I'd been thrown away like trash. You weren't, Eli said instinctively, the words empty and useless. I was, she corrected him, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. Even if you weren't the one who did the throwing. Mara started to cry then, small, hiccuping sobs that tore at the air. I just wanted a mama, she wailed, burying her face in her father's coat. I didn't want to be the only girl in town without one. Something inside Claire broke. The shame, the anger, it all melted away, replaced by a wave of aching pity for this tiny, motherless girl. She saw a reflection of her own lonely childhood in those desperate tears. Ignoring her own pain, she knelt in the slush, her knees protesting. She gently brushed a stray braid from Mara's tear-streaked cheek. I'm not mad at you, Claire said softly, her voice surprisingly steady. You were just brave enough to ask for what you wanted. Then she rose and faced Eli, her chin held high. The fight in her wasn't dead after all. I have nowhere else to go, she stated, not as a plea, but as a fact. No family, no money. I spent every last cent I had getting here, chasing a promise that wasn't real. Eli looked at her, then at his weeping daughter, then back at the unforgiving, snow-choked landscape. He was trapped. He hesitated, a war playing out across his face, but then he gave a slow, reluctant nod. We can offer you a roof, he said, the words careful, measured. A warm meal, but that's all. Nothing more is promised. That, Claire said, her voice tight, is more than I've had in a long, long time. He reached for her suitcase, his hand brushing hers. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. She didn't pull away. He lifted the bag, and together, the three of them, a broken man, a forgotten woman, and a lonely child, walked away from the station, their footsteps making new tracks in the fresh snow. None of them knew it, none of them could have possibly understood it, but they weren't just walking toward a cabin, they were walking toward a reckoning. The cabin was less a home and more a fortress against the wilderness. It hunkered on a ridge, half buried in snow, the pines crowding in like silent, judgmental sentinels. Inside, the cold was a living thing, seeping from the log walls and wooden floorboards. It was a damp, still cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the 2 years of grief that had soaked into the very grain of the place. Claire stood just inside the door, her suitcase a dead weight in her hand, feeling like an intruder in a tomb. Eli's hospitality was as stark as the landscape. He gestured toward a narrow cot tucked into a corner of the main room, near the cold black stove. "You can sleep here," he said, his tone flat. He didn't offer to take her coat. He didn't offer a hot drink. He just pointed to the cot and then retreated into the cabin's only other room, the one he shared with Mara, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality that was louder than a slam. Claire was alone again, in a silence that felt heavier than the one at the station. This silence had a history. Mara, however, lingered. She stood a few feet away, her big, curious eyes taking in every detail of this strange woman her letter had summoned. "Do you know how to bake?" she asked, her voice a small mouse squeak in the oppressive quiet. A faint, tired smile touched Claire's lips. "Sometimes." "Mama used to make bread that smelled like sunshine," Mara whispered, a faraway look in her eyes. "I remember the smell, but sometimes I can't remember her face all the way. Does that make me bad?" Claire's heart gave a painful twist. She set down her suitcase and crouched to meet the girl's gaze. "No, sweetheart, it doesn't make you bad. It just means your memories are making room for new things." She stayed there for a moment, her hand hovering just above the girl's head, wanting to offer a comfort she wasn't sure she had a right to give. From behind the closed door came the low murmur of Eli's voice, and then the door creaked open. He stood there watching them, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but his presence was a wall between them. Mara scurried past him into the room, and the door closed again, leaving Claire truly, finally alone in the cold, dark heart of the cabin. The next few days passed in a strained, unspoken truce. They were not a family. They were three strangers bound by a child's lie, orbiting each other in careful, silent paths. Claire became a ghost in their house, a creature of function. She rose before the sun, her breath fogging in the frigid air, and coaxed the fire in the stove back to life. She fetched icy water from the well, boiled oats for a breakfast that was eaten without a single word, and swept floors that seemed to gather dust from sorrow itself. She discovered a small framed photograph tucked away in a dusty box. It was of a woman with Mara's eyes and a gentle smile, Eli's late wife. Without asking, Claire cleaned the glass, polished the frame, and set it on the small mantelpiece above the hearth. When Eli saw it, he froze, his jaw tight. He stared at it for a long minute, then turned and walked out of the cabin without a word, staying gone for hours. The picture, however, remained on the mantel, a silent acknowledgement. Eli was a man carved from the Wyoming winter, hard, distant, and unforgiving. He spent his days in the barn or chopping wood, his axe strokes ringing through the frozen air with a violent finality. He rarely looked at Claire, and when he did, his eyes were guarded, his face a shuttered window. She was a problem he hadn't asked for, a constant reminder of his daughter's desperate loneliness and his own failure to fix it. He provided a roof and food as promised, but his charity was as cold as the coins he used to pay for supplies in town. Yet there were cracks in the ice, or small, almost imperceptible things. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, the wind whipping the wet sheets against her face, she heard a steady hammering from above. She looked up to see Eli on the roof, his form dark against the gray sky, methodically patching a section that had been leaking onto her cot. He hadn't said a word about it. He just did it. Another evening, she burned her hand on the cast iron skillet. She gasped, dropping the pan with a clatter, and ran her hand under the cold water from the pump. A moment later, Eli appeared at her side. He didn't speak, just took her hand gently, examined the angry red mark, and then fetched a small tin of salve from a high shelf. His rough, calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as he applied the balm. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in his, she saw a flicker of something other than resentment. It looked like concern. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. The longest night came when Mara's sniffles turned into a deep, rattling cough. A fever set in, and the child tossed and turned, crying out in her sleep. Claire sat by her bedside all night, bathing her forehead with cool cloths and whispering the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her. She must have drifted off because she woke with a start to find a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. Eli's blanket. He was standing by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. He hadn't woken her. He had simply tried to give her warmth. The next morning, as Claire braided Mara's hair, the fever now broken, the little girl looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Daddy stayed up too," she whispered. "He watched you." Claire's hands stilled. "I think he likes you," Mara added, with the simple, devastating wisdom of a child. "He's just being kind," Claire replied, her voice a little too tight. "He doesn't do that," Mara said, shaking her head. "He doesn't do kind." Claire finished the braid and turned away, a strange, unfamiliar ache blooming in her chest. The cabin was still a cold, lonely place, filled with the ghosts of a life that wasn't hers. But for the first time, she felt a tiny spark. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was just a flicker of warmth in the suffocating dark. And it was enough to make her wonder what would happen if the silence finally broke. The fire was dying, the embers glowing like sleeping dragon eyes in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up, a mournful howl that seemed to be searching for something it could never find. Inside, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, heavy with unspoken words. Claire sat on a low stool, mending a tear in Mara's small coat. The rhythmic push and pull of the needle, a small anchor in the tense stillness. Mara was asleep in the other room, her breathing soft and even. Eli had been pacing for the better part of an hour, a caged bear in his own home, moving from the window to the door and back again. Finally, he stopped. "Claire." She didn't look up, but her hands paused. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He walked closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight. I I owe you an apology." Still, she said nothing. Her focus remained on the tiny stitches, each one a small, perfect act of control in a world where she had none. "That day at the station," he began, his voice rough, "I was shocked. I wasn't prepared for any of it. For you." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of deep discomfort. "I know I've been distant, cold. It wasn't fair to you. You gave up everything to come here on a promise, and you walked into this." He gestured vaguely at the Spartan cabin, at the silence, at himself. She finally glanced up, her eyes cool and unreadable. They weren't angry, but they weren't forgiving either. They were just waiting. "Mara was so lonely," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the closed bedroom door. "Her mother, Sarah, she was the sun. When she died, it was like the light just went out. In this house, in me. I haven't known how to fix it for Mara. I should have seen how desperate she was." He looked back at Claire. "But this isn't about her. It's about you." He took another step closer. "I see what you do here. You've brought a quietness, a warmth. The fire burns brighter. The food, it tastes like something again." Mara laughs. I haven't heard her really laugh in 2 years. He hesitated, the next words seeming to catch in his throat. "I've been alone for a long time. I guess I forgot how to not be. I didn't want you to feel like you were an obligation. I didn't want you to think you had to earn your keep here." Claire's hands began to tremble, just slightly. The needle slipped from her fingers, falling silently onto the rough fabric. "What I'm trying to say," Eli said, his voice dropping lower, more earnest than she'd ever heard it, "is that I was wrong. Maybe, maybe this mistake could be something else. Maybe if you wanted to stay, we could try to build something." "No." The word was a whip crack, sharp and sudden and utterly final. It sliced through his clumsy confession, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Claire looked up at him, and for the first time the cool mask was gone. Her eyes were blazing with a fire he hadn't known she possessed, a fire forged in a lifetime of being underestimated and undervalued. "You think this is what I want?" she said, her voice low and trembling with fury as she slowly rose to her feet. To be a mistake that you might generously decide to try and make something of? To be a charity case, waiting for the master of the house to determine if I'm worthy of a place by his fire? That's not what I meant, he started, taking a step back. It's exactly what you meant, she shot back, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You think I came here looking for a rescue? I came here looking for a partner, for a life. I have fought for every scrap of dignity I have ever owned. I scrubbed floors and stitched until my fingers bled to pay off debts that weren't mine. I have survived men who looked at me and saw nothing but an object to be used. I will not stay in a house where I am seen as an inconvenience to be tolerated out of pity. Claire, please, just listen. I have listened, she cried, her voice breaking. I have listened to the silence for days. I have listened to the floorboards creak while you pace. And now I have listened to you tell me that maybe, just maybe, I'm good enough to not be thrown back out into the snow. Well, I'm done listening. She turned from him, her back rigid. The argument was over. He stood there, hands half raised in a useless gesture of peace, his apology shattered into 1,000 pieces around him. He had tried to open a door, but he had used the wrong key, and now it had been slammed shut in his face. He watched her walk to her cot, the small, proud set of her shoulders a final, devastating rebuke. He had tried to offer her a home, and instead, he had just confirmed that she was a prisoner. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to nothing but gray ash, Claire moved through the silent cabin like a wraith. With methodical precision, she packed her few belongings back into her worn suitcase. She worked in the dark, her movements sure and silent, careful not to wake the sleeping child in the next room. There was nothing left for her here. She had traded one kind of prison for another, and she would rather face the storm outside than the suffocating pity within these four walls. She folded the simple dress she had mended and placed it on the cot, a payment for her brief stay. Then she took a small rag doll she had stitched together from scraps for Mara's upcoming birthday. She crept into the other room, the moonlight through the small window illuminating the child's peaceful face. She placed the doll on the nightstand, a soft, silent goodbye. Beside it, she left a small, folded note. Her handwriting was neat, precise, betraying none of the turmoil in her heart. I am not your mama. I was just a woman who got off at the wrong stop. She didn't allow herself a single tear. Tears were a luxury she had given up long ago. She pulled on her thin coat, took a deep breath of the cold, still air of the cabin, and then she slipped out the door, closing it gently behind her. The latch clicked into place with a soft, final sound. The blizzard had returned with a vengeance. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was a solid, moving wall of white, a furious, churning chaos that swallowed sound and sight. The wind shrieked, tearing at her clothes, trying to rip the breath from her lungs. Claire leaned into it, a lone, dark figure against the blinding white, and walked. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. Her footprints, the only evidence she had ever been there at all, were erased by the storm almost as soon as she made them. Eli woke to a silence that was wrong. It wasn't the usual quiet of the early morning. It was an empty, hollow silence. A void. He got up, his stockinged feet cold on the floorboards. The main room was empty. Her cot was neatly made, a folded dress lying on top. His stomach clenched. Then he saw it. The door to Mara's room was ajar. He pushed it open. Mara was still sleeping, but on her nightstand was the rag doll and the note. His hands shook as he picked it up. The words were a knife in his gut. I am not your mama. He stumbled back out into the main room, his mind reeling. He looked at the peg by the door where she hung her coat. Empty. Her thin scarf was gone too. No, he whispered. No, no, no. He threw the cabin door open. The storm hit him like a physical blow, a furious wall of wind and ice. He could see nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Her footprints were gone, vanished. It was as if she had been an apparition, a dream that had dissolved with the morning light. Claire! He roared into the wind, her name torn from his throat. Claire! The storm swallowed the sound, throwing it back in his face. There was no answer. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He didn't think. He acted. He threw on his heaviest coat, his boots, his furs. His best horse was lame. The ice had seen to that weeks ago. It didn't matter. He saddled the old stubborn mule, an animal as resilient and cantankerous as the land itself. He grabbed a lantern, though he knew it would be nearly useless, and without a backward glance, he rode out into the heart of the blizzard. He was a man chasing a ghost. The world was a featureless, white hell. He had no trail to follow, only a desperate, gut-wrenching instinct. He pushed the mule forward, his own body numb, the cold a distant fact. His only focus was the image of her face, the fire in her eyes when she had confronted him. He had been so wrong. He had seen her strength, her resilience, but he had mistaken it for something that didn't need care, didn't need softness. He had offered her a place to stay when what he should have offered her was a reason to. Hours passed. The sky remained a bruised, colorless gray. He was about to turn back, the cold seeping into his own bones, a creeping despair telling him it was too late, when he saw it. Through a momentary lull in the swirling snow, a dark shape. An old, collapsed lean-to behind what was once a homesteader's barn, long since abandoned to the elements. It was the only shelter for miles, a tombstone in a field of white. He urged the mule on, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slid from the saddle, his legs stiff and clumsy, and fought his way through a deep drift to the dilapidated structure. The door was hanging off one hinge, banging a grim, rhythmic beat in the wind. He forced it open, and there she was. She was curled in a corner, a small, tight ball, trying to conserve a warmth that was already gone. Her lips were blue. Her skin had a waxy, translucent pallor. A fine dusting of snow covered her hair and shoulders, blown in through the cracks in the walls. Her eyes were closed, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and forgotten. "Claire," he breathed, the name a prayer. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands clumsy as he reached for her. Her skin was like ice. He worked frantically, his panic giving way to a fierce, desperate resolve. He tore off his own heavy fur coat and wrapped it around her small, shivering form, pulling her against his chest, trying to force his own body heat into her. He chafed her hands, her arms, her back, his rough hands moving with a desperate urgency. "Claire, can you hear me?" he said, his voice cracking. "Listen to me. You do not get to do this. You do not get to leave like this. You don't get to freeze to death alone in a barn because I am a fool who doesn't know how to use his words." Her eyelashes fluttered. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her. "That's it," he urged, his voice thick with emotion. "Fight. You fight for everything else. You fight for this." A single frozen tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path through the snow on her cheek. He leaned in close, his forehead pressing against hers, his breath mingling with her faint, frosty puffs. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words raw and broken, stripped of all his pride and fear. "I was wrong about everything. Just come home. Please, Claire, come home with me." He lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He carried her out of the shed and back into the raging storm, his own survival secondary to the fragile life he now held. The journey back was a slow, agonizing crawl through a world that wanted them dead. He held her in front of him on the mule, his arms a shield against the wind, her body tucked inside his coat. He kept talking to her, a low, constant murmur of promises and apologies, telling her about the spring thaw, about the wildflowers that grew on the ridge, about his daughter who missed her already. He was talking not just to keep her awake, but to convince himself that he hadn't found her too late. Every time she stirred, every time a faint sigh escaped her lips, it fueled his resolve. He wasn't just fighting the storm anymore. He was fighting for a future he hadn't realized he wanted until the moment he was about to lose it forever. By the time the faint outline of the cabin appeared through the snow, a smudge of smoke from its chimney, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen, the storm was beginning to break. The sky was turning a pale, bruised lavender in the east. He had ridden through the longest night of his life and had, by some miracle, come out the other side. He carried her inside, laid her gently on his own bed, the one he had shared with his wife, and began the slow, painstaking work of bringing her back from the brink. He built the fire up until it roared. He boiled water. He chafed her frozen limbs until his own arms ached. He did not leave her side for a moment. Hours later, when she finally opened her eyes, the world swam back into focus slowly. The first thing she saw was his face. He was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his face etched with worry. In his hands, he held a steaming bowl. He hadn't rehearsed any speeches. There were no more clumsy apologies. There was just his presence, solid and unwavering. And in his eyes, there was something new, something she had never seen there before. It was raw, and it was vulnerable, and it was warmer than any fire. Morning arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. A soft, pale light filtered through the single window, painting long, dusty stripes across the wooden floor. Claire awoke slowly, feeling as though she were surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. She was cocooned in a mountain of quilts, and the air, for the first time since she'd arrived, was genuinely warm. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee hung in the air. The cabin was quiet, but it was a gentle quiet, not the oppressive silence she had fled from. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness washed over her, but it passed. On the small table beside the bed sat a bowl of porridge, steam still rising from it in lazy curls. And next to the bowl was a folded piece of paper. Her heart gave a lurch. With a hand that still trembled, she reached for the note. The handwriting was not neat or practiced. It was the rough, deliberate scrawl of a man who worked with his hands, not with a pen. The words were simple, stripped of any pretense. Claire, I don't know the right way to say this, so I'm just going to say it plain. I am sorry, not just for being a fool. I am sorry for not seeing you. I saw a woman who was strong, who had weathered more storms than I could imagine, and I was afraid. Afraid of what you might need from me, when I felt like I had nothing left to give. I was wrong. You didn't come here empty-handed. You came with a strength that shames me, and a quiet kindness that this house had forgotten. Since you arrived, things are different. Mara smiles in her sleep. The corners of this cabin don't feel so dark. I find myself listening for your footsteps. Mara needs you. That's the plain truth of it. And if I'm being honest with myself, so do I. Not for the cooking or the mending, not because my daughter tricked you into coming here, but because when you are here, this place feels less like a shelter and more like a home. It's been a long time since I felt that. I don't know what comes next, but I know I don't want to go back to the silence that was here before you. Stay, not because you have to, not out of pity, but because maybe. Maybe we can find out what this is. Together. Eli. She read the letter once, then twice. Her fingers traced his name at the bottom of the page. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It was something far more rare and precious. It was the truth. It was a confession from a man who had barricaded his heart against the world, and he was now admitting that she had found a crack in the wall. She looked at the porridge, still warm, still waiting, a peace offering. She could have written a reply. She could have told him yes, but words had failed them before. Words were clumsy things, easily broken. Actions were solid. They were real. Slowly, deliberately, she swung her legs out of the bed. She stood, pulling one of the heavy quilts around her shoulders. She walked not to the table to write, but to the small basin of water on the washstand. She washed her face. She braided her hair, her fingers still stiff but obedient. Then, wrapped in the quilt, she moved into the heart of the cabin, the small kitchen area. She found the sack of flour, the tin of baking soda, the last of the dried herbs. Her movements were quiet, purposeful. An hour later, Eli came back inside, his arms loaded with freshly split firewood. He stopped dead in the doorway, the wood nearly tumbling from his grasp. The cabin was transformed. A fire blazed in the hearth. The table, which had always been bare, was set for a meal. A simple stew made from the few root vegetables she'd found simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of rosemary and thyme. A plate of fresh, warm biscuits sat beside it. The air didn't just smell like food. It smelled like care. It smelled like forgiveness. Claire didn't look at him immediately. She gave the stew one final, slow stir. Then she turned, her expression calm. "The roads should be clear enough to get to town tomorrow," she said, her voice even. "We're almost out of salt." Eli just stood there, snow melting from his boots onto the floor, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. She wasn't talking about leaving. She was talking about restocking the pantry. She was talking about a future, about a we. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features, making him look years younger. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say, "I'm glad you're staying." He didn't need to. He just nodded. "All right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "Salt." Their eyes met across the warm, fragrant room. No vows were spoken. No promises were made. But something solid and unbreakable clicked into place between them. It was an understanding that ran deeper than words. She had run from him, and he had come for her. And in that desperate frozen landscape, they had found each other. They were home. The seasons turned. The brutal Wyoming winter finally loosened its grip, giving way to a muddy, hesitant spring. The snow receded, revealing the promise of green beneath. The silence in the cabin had been replaced by a comfortable rhythm of life. The clatter of pans, the murmur of conversation, Mara's laughter echoing off the log walls. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. Claire and Eli moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a dance of shared tasks and quiet companionship. They were building something, day by day, biscuit by biscuit, mended seam by mended seam. One afternoon, as Claire was hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines, the fresh scent of sun on wet linen filling the air, she saw them, a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving too fast for a farmer's wagon. Three riders, dark shapes against the burgeoning green of the valley. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. These weren't cowboys. They weren't travelers. They rode with a grim, predatory purpose. As they drew closer, the dread turned to ice. She recognized the man in the lead, the swagger in his saddle, the cruel set of his mouth, and the scar, a jagged white line that twisted from his lip to his jaw, a souvenir from a bar fight she'd witnessed years ago. It was Jedediah Kane, the man her father had owed the most money to, the man who had looked at her with cold, calculating eyes and told her there were other ways to pay a debt. She dropped the laundry basket and ran for the cabin. "Eli!" He came out onto the porch, a rifle in his hand, drawn by the urgency in her voice. He saw the riders now pulling up at the edge of their small plot of land, their horses stamping impatiently. Mara peeked out from behind Claire's skirts, her eyes wide with fear. "What's your business here?" Eli called out, his voice flat and hard as iron. The rifle wasn't pointed at them, but it rested in his arms with a casual menace. Kane dismounted, his spurs jingling with a sound that made Claire's skin crawl. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Our business," he said, his voice a low sneer, "is her." He jerked his chin toward Claire. Claire stepped forward, moving to stand beside Eli, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of defiance. "I don't have any business with you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "The debt is paid." Kane chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, the money's paid, sweetheart. Your daddy's slate is clean. But there's the matter of interest, a principle. You ran, you disappeared, left a lot of folks disappointed. We've come to collect what's owed." His eyes roamed over her, insolent and proprietary. "She owes you nothing," Eli growled, taking a step forward. "Now get off my land before I make you." Kane's smile vanished. "This ain't your fight, farmer. Step aside." "Anything that happens on this land," Eli said, raising the rifle to his shoulder, "is my fight." Everything happened at once. Kane went for his pistol. Eli fired. The shot boomed through the quiet afternoon, sending a flock of birds scattering from the trees. One of Kane's men screamed and tumbled from his horse, clutching a shattered leg. The second man drew his own gun and fired wildly. The bullet whizzed past Eli's head, splintering the doorframe behind him. Claire screamed and pulled Mara back. Eli fired again, but the third man was faster. He took careful aim, not at Eli, but at the center of his chest. Claire saw it happen in slow motion, the man's finger tightening on the trigger, the cold, dead certainty in his eyes. There was no time to shout, no time to think. She acted. She threw herself in front of Eli. The world exploded in a starburst of white-hot pain. The impact felt like being kicked by a horse, lifting her off her feet and throwing her backward onto the hard-packed dirt of the porch. She landed with a sickening thud, the air driven from her lungs. She heard Eli roar her name, a sound of pure, primal fury. She heard another gunshot, then the frantic sound of galloping horses, fading into the distance. Then there was only Eli's face above her, his features twisted in agony and terror. "Claire! Oh God, no! Claire, stay with me!" She tried to take a breath, but it was like breathing fire. There was a sticky warmth spreading across her side. "Mara!" she gasped. "She's inside. She's safe," he said, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her. "Don't talk. Just breathe." She blinked up at him, a faint pained smile touching her lips. "You're bleeding," she whispered, noticing the dark stain spreading on his sleeve where the first man's bullet had grazed him. He let out a choked, hysterical laugh that was half a sob. "So are you, you damn fool!" "Guess that makes us even," she murmured, and then the world went dark. She woke up in her bed, the scent of antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. The town doctor, a grim man with kind eyes, was packing his bag. Eli sat in the chair beside her, his arm bandaged, his face pale and haggard. He hadn't left her side. The bullet, the doctor explained, had gone clean through. It had missed anything vital by less than an inch. She was lucky, but it wasn't luck. It was a choice. The gunfight changed everything. Word traveled fast in a small town. The story of the mail-order bride who took a bullet for her man became local legend. The whispers and suspicious stares that had followed Claire through town evaporated. When she was finally well enough to walk to the mercantile, leaning on Eli's arm, people nodded to her. Mrs. Holloway from the bakery pressed a warm loaf of bread into her hands and refused payment. Old Mr. Jensen, who had once called her a mail-order mistake under his breath, tipped his hat to her. She hadn't earned their respect with a marriage certificate. She had earned it with her blood. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She belonged. They never had a proper wedding. There was no preacher, no white dress, no fancy ceremony. There was just one quiet evening, weeks later, as summer began to settle over the valley. Mara was asleep. The fire was crackling, and Claire was kneading dough on the flour-dusted kitchen table. She looked up at Eli, who was watching her from his chair, a quiet contentment on his face. "We're going to need more flour soon," she said simply. He smiled, a slow, easy smile. "Already making plans, are you?" She shrugged, a dusting of flour on her cheek. "Someone has to." He got up, came over to the table, and gently took her floury hands in his. He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't ask her to be his wife. He just stood there, holding her hands, his thumb gently tracing circles on her skin. And in that quiet, simple gesture, she heard everything she ever needed to hear. This was her home. This was her family. Not one born of a letter or a promise, but one forged in snowstorms and sealed in gunpowder. A love that hadn't arrived with vows, but with choice, courage, and the quiet, stubborn care that had turned a cold, empty cabin into a place where three broken people had finally become whole. If Claire's journey from a frozen train station to the heart of a found family proves that the strongest bonds are the ones we choose to fight for, then hit that subscribe button. Don't miss another tale from the frontier, where love is a currency more valuable than gold, and courage is the only law that matters. Stay tuned, because the next story is already waiting just over the horizon.